The Battle of Richmond Hill, also referred to as the Richmond Hill Massacre, occurred in May 1795 in the Hawkesbury region of New South Wales, Australia. This confrontation between the indigenous Darug people and the New South Wales Corps, accompanied by armed settlers, is often cited as the first recorded battle between Aboriginal Australians and European colonists. Hi there, I'm Kyle, the host of History of Human Evolution, with a PhD in history and a love for storytelling. I'm here to guide you through the fascinating journey of our species. If you like to explore the past, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below. In the year 1794, British settlers began expanding their presence along the Hawkesbury River, a fertile stretch of land in New South Wales that had long sustained the Darug people. For generations, the Darug had cultivated and foraged along the riverbanks, relying on the yam beds and native flora that thrived in the region. Their way of life was structured around seasonal rhythms, an intricate system of knowledge passed down through time. But as British settlers arrived in increasing numbers, the landscape began to change. Clearing the land for agriculture, settlers introduced crops such as Indian corn, a plant foreign to the soil but essential to the colonial economy. With axes and plows, they disrupted the ecosystem, eradicating native food sources and fencing off areas that had once been freely accessed by indigenous groups. To the Darug, the settlers' actions were not simply environmental destruction, they were an existential threat. The yams, which had been carefully maintained, were replaced with rows of corn that settlers now claimed as their own. As hunger set in, the Darug began taking what food they could from the fields. In their worldview, the land did not belong to any one group. It was a shared resource. To the settlers, however, the Darug's actions were theft, an attack on their hard-earned livelihood. Disputes escalated. Settlers armed themselves, forming patrols to guard their crops, while the Darug, well-versed in the terrain, retaliated with raids on farms. These were not random acts of violence, but deliberate responses to the growing crisis imposed by colonial expansion. Hostility reached new heights when settlers kidnapped indigenous children, a strategy aimed at both retaliation and forced assimilation. In response, the Darug intensified their resistance, targeting homesteads, destroying livestock, and striking where the settlers were most vulnerable. Fear spread through the colony. Rumors circulated that a larger conflict was on the horizon. In Sydney, acting Governor William Patterson took decisive action. Convinced that a show of force was necessary to reassert colonial authority, he ordered a military operation into the Hawkesbury region. With the New South Wales Corps at their command, the British prepared for a campaign that would mark one of the earliest large-scale confrontations between Indigenous Australians and European forces. The Darug, however, were not passive victims of this unfolding crisis. They understood the stakes, and they would not abandon their lands without a fight. Under the cover of darkness, a detachment of the New South Wales Corps, accompanied by armed settlers, moved through the Hawkesbury region. They had clear orders: locate the Darug resistance and eliminate them. Captain William Patterson, commanding from Sydney, had authorized a level of force that left no ambiguity. This was not a negotiation. For the Darug, the conflict had been escalating for months. Their attacks on farms had disrupted the colonial food supply, and settlers had begun retreating into fortified homesteads. Now, their adversaries were bringing the fight directly to them. The Darug were no strangers to warfare. Their warriors were skilled in guerrilla tactics, striking quickly before vanishing into the dense bushland. They understood the terrain in ways the British could not, using the river, the thick vegetation, and the rugged cliffs to their advantage. As the soldiers neared Richmond Hill, they encountered a Darug encampment. What followed was swift and brutal. Musket fire shattered the silence, cutting through the trees as soldiers fired upon the camp. The Darug, though caught off guard, did not surrender. Warriors fought back with spears and clubs, moving rapidly between the trees, launching their weapons before retreating into the night. But the firepower of the British was overwhelming. The accuracy of musketry in such conditions was unreliable, but against a largely unarmed camp, it was devastating. By morning, The battlefield was eerily quiet. The Darug had vanished into the landscape, leaving behind the bodies of those who had not escaped. The official reports were vague, accounts varied, but at least 7 to 8 Darug people were confirmed dead. Others may have perished, but were taken by their kin before sunrise. Among the captured were 5 survivors, including a woman carrying a wounded infant. The child, struck by British musket fire, would not survive. The soldiers withdrew, their orders carried out. To the settlers, this was a victory, a message that resistance would be met with force. But for the Darug, the war was far from over. Their land had been taken, their people killed, but their resolve had not been broken. The Hawkesbury frontier would not know peace for many years to come. In the days that followed, the settlers of the Hawkesbury region felt a momentary sense of relief. The New South Wales Corps had carried out its orders, and the Darug resistance, at least for now, had been suppressed. But the reality was far more complex. The battle at Richmond Hill was not an end, it was a catalyst. The violence of that night only hardened the resolve of the Darug people, who had now seen firsthand the lengths to which the British would go to protect their expanding settlements. Tensions in the region remained high. Settlers continued expanding their farms, pushing deeper into indigenous territory, while the Darug adapted their tactics. Their raids became more calculated, their movements more elusive. They no longer targeted just crops, but began striking at isolated homesteads, catching settlers off guard. The conflict became one of attrition, with neither side able to claim lasting dominance. For the British, maintaining control required constant military presence. For the Darug, it meant fighting for survival on land that had been theirs for generations. In Sydney, the colonial government viewed the events at Richmond Hill as a necessary demonstration of force. Governor John Hunter, who replaced Patterson shortly after the battle, upheld the aggressive policies of his predecessor. Settlers were granted more land, and with each expansion, the cycle of violence continued. By the early 1800s, the Hawkesbury had become one of the most contested frontiers in the colony. Skirmishes between indigenous warriors and colonial forces were frequent, with casualties on both sides mounting. The legacy of the battle endured far beyond the immediate conflict. The Darug population suffered immense losses, not only in lives but in displacement, as their traditional lands were seized and divided among settlers. Smallpox, introduced by the British, spread rapidly through indigenous communities, further devastating those who had already faced war and dispossession. The structures of Darug society, once centered around the rhythms of the river and the land, were systematically dismantled by colonial expansion. Decades later, as the frontier wars raged across the continent, the events at Richmond Hill were largely forgotten by the settlers who now lived on the land. But for the Darug, the memory remained. Their resistance had not ended in 1795. It continued, passed down through generations, a reminder of a time when their people stood against the might of an empire. The battle was not just a moment of conflict. It was part of a larger struggle, one that would define the colonial history of Australia for years to come. For much of Australia's colonial history, the Battle of Richmond Hill remained absent from mainstream narratives. Official records were sparse, and for generations, the event was overshadowed by broader accounts of settlement and expansion. Yet, among the Darug people, the memory endured. Stories of resistance, loss, and survival were passed down, preserving a history that the colonial authorities had sought to erase. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that efforts to publicly acknowledge the conflict began to take shape. Historians and indigenous communities worked to reconstruct the events of 1795, bringing attention to the violent foundations upon which the Hawkesbury settlements were built. This push for recognition coincided with a broader reassessment of Australia's frontier wars, challenging the long-standing myth of peaceful settlement. In 2002, a significant step was taken with the establishment of a memorial garden at the St. John of God Hospital in North Richmond. Situated on land that had once been the site of Darug resistance, the memorial was created to honor those who had fought and perished in the struggle for their land. A quiet space of reflection, it stands as one of the few physical markers of the battle, a place where the descendants of both the settlers and the Darug people can acknowledge the past. Commemorative ceremonies and educational initiatives have since emerged, ensuring that the conflict is no longer relegated to the margins of history. Local schools, community groups, and historical societies have begun incorporating the events at Richmond Hill into discussions of colonial expansion and indigenous resistance. These efforts seek to not only recognize past injustices, but also foster a deeper understanding of the lasting impacts of dispossession. Yet, the process of memorialization remains contested. Unlike battlefields of the world wars, which are marked and preserved, sites of Australia's frontier conflicts often remain unmarked, their histories debated or ignored. The Battle of Richmond Hill is no exception. Calls for further recognition, including formal plaques and national acknowledgement, continued to face resistance from those who prefer to frame Australia's colonial past in terms of progress rather than conflict. For the Darug people, the battle is not a relic of the past. It is a defining moment in their history, a symbol of both devastation and resilience. Whether through oral tradition, community initiatives, or the quiet presence of a memorial garden, the memory of those who fought at Richmond Hill endures, resisting the silence that once threatened to erase them from history. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.